Hello Stat 200 and welcome to Lesson 9. We'll be continuing where we left off last week. Last week we covered inferential methods with one sample. This week we'll cover inferential methods with two independent samples. Let's start with a quick review. These are the general formulas for confidence intervals and test statistics. All of the procedures that we covered last week followed these general forms, and all of the procedures that we'll cover this week will as well. We'll cover procedures concerning two independent proportions and two independent means this week. For each topic, we'll learn how to construct a confidence interval and how to conduct a hypothesis test. Remember that Minitab Express will do all of these calculations for you. It will not, however, check assumptions for you. So you'll need to check assumptions yourself and determine whether or not it's appropriate to use the methods that we're going to be covering this week. When assumptions are met, these are the preferred methods. Let's start by looking at two independent proportions procedures. For two independent proportions, if n times p and n times 1 minus p are at least 10 in both groups, the sampling distribution can be approximated using a z-distribution. Now, for both a confidence interval and in hypothesis testing, we don't have any population proportion values. With confidence intervals, we're estimating the population values, and with hypothesis testing, we're testing to see if the population proportions are different. In both cases, we can check this assumption by looking at the number of successes and failures in both samples. N times p is the number of successes, and n times 1 minus p is the number of failures. In order to use the normal approximation methods with two independent proportions, we need to have at least 10 successes and at least 10 failures in both groups. These are the formulas that you'll see this week. The formulas are getting a bit more complex now, but remember that Minitab Express will do these calculations for you. One thing that I do want to point out in the formulas is that when constructing a confidence interval, the sample proportions are used to compute the standard error. For computing a test statistic, we need to compute what is known as a pooled proportion. This difference is because hypothesis testing assumes that the population proportions are equal, and therefore they should be estimated together. Confidence intervals are not constructed under that assumption, so we estimate the proportions separately. You should pay special attention to this when using Minitab Express, because you'll need to tell it whether you want to estimate the proportions separately or if you want to use a pooled estimate. Note how these formulas are similar to the general forms that you've seen before. For the confidence interval, it's still the observed sample statistic plus or minus the multiplier times the standard error. For the test statistic, it's the difference in the sample minus 0, because the null hypothesis is that there's no difference or that the difference is 0, divided by the standard error. And finally, for two independent means, if both sample sizes are at least 30, or if the populations are known to be normally distributed, the sampling distribution can be approximated using a t-distribution. Here we have our formulas. Again, these follow the general formats that we've been working with. For the confidence interval, we have the sample statistic plus or minus the multiplier times the standard error. The degrees of freedom here, we will estimate as the smaller sample size minus 1. Minitab Express uses a more complex formula though, so note that if you conduct this test by hand, your results may be slightly different from what Minitab Express finds. For the test statistic, we have the sample statistic. Then sometimes you'll see a minus 0 here because the null hypothesis is that there's no difference or that the difference is 0, divided by the standard error. Those are both of the key topics that we're going to cover this week. Before I leave you, I want to review a few strategies to help you get through this week. Start by assessing the research question. Identifying the variables correctly is key. You need to be able to read a scenario and determine if the response variable is categorical or quantitative, so that you know if you're dealing with a proportion or a mean. And you need to know if you have one sample, paired samples, or independent samples. Pay attention to the similarities. You've seen many formulas between this week and last week. Always look for the similarities. The structure of the formulas for confidence intervals and test statistics that you've learned so far are very similar. And when possible, use Minitab Express. You'll need to check assumptions by hand, but use Minitab Express to construct confidence intervals and to compute test statistics. This concludes the Lesson 9 overview video. As always, if you have any questions this week, please post them to the Lesson 9 discussion board in Canvas.